Welcome to the Progressive Christian Bible Study. We are now entering what's called Ordinary Time on the church calendar. We're coming up on Proper 7 in the season of Pentecost. And this coming Sunday, the gospel reading comes from Luke chapter 8, and it is an exorcism story about a man possessed by what he calls legion, and Jesus sets him free. And it's a story that's consistent with something else that's going on this Sunday, which is Juneteenth. So this Sunday is June 19th, the holiday that celebrates the liberation of enslaved people. So, consistent with that, I'm going to share a prayer with you, the first of the 3 Ps, that is a prayer for Juneteenth. Holy and righteous God, you created us in your image. Grant us grace to contend fearlessly against evil and to make no peace with oppression. Help us, like those of generations before us, resist the evil of slavery and human bondage in any form and any manner of oppression. Help us to use our freedoms to bring justice among people and nations everywhere, to the glory of your holy name, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay, now for today's perspective. And again, we're looking at this demon possession story in Luke chapter 8. And whenever we get into these exorcism stories, they can sound a little strange to our modern ears. So I want to shed some light on the story by looking at it from the perspective of cross-cultural anthropology. And I'm drawing on a classic text in the field of biblical studies written by a scholar named John Dominic Crossan. And it's his book titled The Historical Jesus. And he has a chapter in there where he talks about exorcism and possession. And he draws from the work of various anthropologists. One of them was Mary Douglas. And she pointed out in her work that there is a connection between the physical body and the social body, so the individual's body and the society as a body. Crossan summarizes her work by writing, quote, "Our attitudes about our bodies arise from society's image of itself." So this perspective is helpful when studying the stories about demon possession in the Gospels, because the stories are never just about one particular individual who is possessed by a demon. The connection between the individual's body and the social body means that a story about a possessed person is also a commentary on society. Crossan points out that in the first century, many Jewish writers divided the world into God's realm and the demonic realm. So God's realm for them was represented in God's people, but the demonic realm was represented in a foreign occupying colonial force. So in the first century, it was the Roman Empire. That was the foreign occupying force in ancient Israel. So here's what Crossan says. Roman imperialism meant that God's people were possessed by demons on the social level. Now, this reading, or this perspective, helps shed some light on some of the features of the story we're about to look at, because in that story, the demon self-identifies as Legion, which was a name for the Roman army. So there's an explicit connection between possession and this foreign occupying force. And then this legion cowers before Jesus, who is a more powerful force that's entered the equation. Jesus commands Legion to enter pigs. Pigs are the quintessential non-kosher animal for ancient Jews and modern Jews as well. And then these demonic pigs rush down a hillside and drown themselves in the sea. So this is a story that is a commentary on society. It almost represents a kind of Jewish hope for liberation from these foreign oppressors. Stories about possession, according to anthropologists, are also stories about colonialism and possession in the social body. So one anthropologist named Barry Reynolds, he studied tribes of the Barotse people in what was once called Northern Rhodesia. And alongside traditional ailments, such as possession by ancestral spirits, he found that some of the Barotsi also suffered from possession by Bindeli, which was their word for European. So what anthropologists have found from cross-cultural study is that situations of social tension, class conflict from economic exploitation, or conflicts over traditions, revered traditions that are beginning to be eroded or cast aside. There are conflicts around traditions, or when traditions are threatened, or situations of colonial domination, a variety of social stressors. These are at the root of possession. And cultures, or even mentalities, doesn't necessarily have to be a particular culture. It could be a mentality in our culture, for example. So cultures or mentalities that are predisposed to supernaturalism in these kind of high-stress social contexts tend to be more open to labeling the physical effects on the body as demonic possession. So this socio-psychological explanation leaves to the side the question of whether there are actual literal demons operating out there somewhere. And that really is an unanswerable question. So I'm happy to sort of put it off to the side, because this kind of cross-cultural explanation helps us focus on something else, which is to see just how connected our physical bodies are to what's going on in the society at large, or the society around us. What affects the social body also affects the physical body. So this brings us to the third of the 3 P's, and it's this story about possession in Luke chapter 8, starting in verse 26, and we'll use this perspective to shed some light on the story. Then they arrived at the country of the Gerasenes, which is opposite Galilee. As Jesus stepped out on land, a man of the city who had demons met him. For a long time he had worn no clothes, and he did not live in a house, but in the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he fell down before him and shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me." For Jesus had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man. For many times it had seized him. He was kept under guard and bound with chains and shackles, but he would break the bonds and be driven by the demon into the wilds. Jesus then asked him, "What is your name?" He said, "Legion," for many demons had entered him. They begged him not to order them to go back into the abyss. Now there on the hillside a large herd of swine was feeding, and the demons begged Jesus to let them enter these. So he gave them permission. Then the demons came out of the man and entered the swine, and the herd rushed down the steep bank and into the lake and was drowned. When the swineherds saw what had happened, they ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then people came out to see what had happened. And when they came to Jesus, they found the man from whom the demons had gone sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Those who had seen it told them how the one who had been possessed by demons had been healed. Then all the people of the surrounding country of the Gerasenes asked Jesus to leave them, for they were seized with great fear. So he got into the boat and returned. The man from whom the demons had gone begged that he might be with Jesus, but Jesus sent him away, saying, "Return to your home and declare how much God has done for you." So he went away, proclaiming throughout the city how much Jesus had done for him. Did you see what Luke did there at the end? How much God had done for you. That's what Jesus wanted him to proclaim. And instead, the man went out and proclaimed how much Jesus had done for him. Nice little switcheroo at the end of that text. So before we get into the issue of possession here, I first want to talk about the geography. So verse 26 says it's in the Gerasenes, the country of the Gerasenes. Interestingly, the Gospel of Matthew changes it to the country of the Gadarenes. Either way, this is Gentile territory. So we have an image here of Jesus crossing a boundary and entering Gentile territory. So this story, we're getting a little clue here that this story is about crossing boundaries, in addition to all the other things that will come up in the story. But first and foremost, it's a story about crossing boundaries. So Jesus enters Gentile territory, but the gospel writers use different names to describe the territory. Mark and Luke use the same term, so it's the country of the Gerasenes. Matthew changes it to the country of the Gadarenes. Now, why the difference? Well, both Matthew and Luke are using Mark as one of their sources when they're writing their gospel. So Mark is their base text. Mark, again, calls it the country of the Gerasenes. Luke follows Mark and uses the same term. Here's the problem. The problem is that Gerasa was nowhere near a body of water in ancient Roman Palestine. And the story says that Jesus sent the demons into the pigs, and the pigs rushed down the hill and into a body of water, a lake, and were drowned. But the problem is, again, that Mark and Luke are describing a region that's nowhere near the water. Matthew changes the place name to the country of the Gadarenes, and Gadara was near the lake of Gennesaret. So by changing the place name, Matthew makes sense of the story in a way that neither Mark nor Luke can or are able to. So Matthew changes the name in order to clarify things. Most likely, neither Luke nor Mark had any idea where these places were. Maybe they drew them from their own individual sources, or at least in the case of Mark, drawing it from his own source. Or maybe it was from word of mouth, and again, he has no idea because he doesn't know the geography of the area. Neither does Luke, because Luke would have changed the name if he did. Presumably, Matthew did have a sense about the geography, recognized that this was a problem in Mark's gospel, and changed the name to make more sense of the story. At the very least, it's an indicator that neither Mark nor Luke are writing from Roman Palestine. They're somewhere else in the Roman world. But again, the important point here, regardless of the place name, is that the first thing that happens in this story is that Jesus crosses a boundary. He's entering Gentile territory. And of course, there are pigs there. Presumably, there aren't pigs in Jerusalem. Now, verse 27 says the man literally, in Greek, had demons, was having demons. So the NRSV does a good job of translating here. He had demons. It doesn't say he was possessed by demons, although that's implied. Literally, it's he had demons. I kind of like the ambiguous phrasing there because it has a much wider relevance because, we use the term a lot, but we might say, wow, that person has demons or is carrying demons if they're addicted or something else is going on in their lives. So I like the phraseology here. The man had demons. We're also told he doesn't live in a house. He lives among the tombs. So it's a picture of a man who's as good as dead, basically. And there's symbolic significance to these details. The man is an outsider. He's dwelling among the dead as if he himself were already as good as dead. Society has rejected him, casted him out. And this has physical effects on his body, which Luke calls possession. Again, that connects with the perspective that we were looking at just a second ago. In verse 28, the man rushes over and falls down before Jesus, and he starts shrieking. And the man begs Jesus not to torment him. What an interesting expression. Would Jesus ever torment someone? Why would this man be so afraid? And here we have to kind of read between the lines and color, or add some color to the story. And I like doing this because it adds new insights that you might not otherwise grasp. So maybe the reason why this man is so afraid is that the only encounters that he ever had with other people were abusive encounters. People maybe throwing stones at him or hurling insults at him or making jokes about him, bullying him in some way. And so when Jesus is near, his first inclination is to be afraid. He's not used to being that close to another human being without having that human being hurt him in some way. Continuing this line of thought, maybe the man had long forgotten what it was like to be loved and cared for. Maybe it had been so long since anyone had ever been kind to him that when he gets close to Jesus, he's immediately afraid, assuming the worst. He sees Jesus as a threat. The image here is of a person who's been completely shut off from loving, compassionate human contact. He's completely shunned, and he's completely worn down physically, emotionally, mentally, because of the society in which he's living. Something's going on around him that's having physical effects on his body. People are treating him as an outcast. We're told another troubling detail in verse 29. Luke writes that the man had been chained and shackled. And just think about that for a moment. Someone in that town must have decided that this was the right course of action to control this person. Chain him up and shackle him down. And presumably, because we're told that he has such physical strength, he can break these chains, that in order to chain him in the first place, whoever came up with this idea must have gotten a group of people together to pin this man down and abuse him even more as they're shackling him and tying him down in order to try to control him. So think about the trauma that this person has endured during their life. And it's also a sad truth about how too often we try to deal with troubling people by locking them up or kicking them out or shunning them or treating them in some way as less than human. But notice how Jesus treats the man. In verse 30, Jesus asks him, "What's your name?" Jesus wants to get to know him. Think about that little detail as well. Jesus is talking to the man, but then when the man answers, he says Legion, which is the name of the demons who possess him. So in some sort of twisted way, this man has so closely identified himself with these demons that are tormenting him that when he answers, he's answering on behalf of the demons, but he's speaking as himself. And Jesus is talking to him as a man. And isn't that the way that social labels or categories or stories function? They function to demoralize and dehumanize the individual so that the individual begins to buy into these categories that are slapped on them and assume that that's who they are, even though they're not. So if a kid is constantly told that they're stupid instead of smart and beautiful, they might begin to believe that story about themselves and so closely identify their own identity with that false story that it becomes part of who they are. Or if a person is told by society or by its laws and by its policing that the color of their skin makes them dangerous, they might begin to believe that story about themselves, that lie about themselves, and then not be able to believe that they are a beloved and precious child of God. Or if a person is treated as a monster because of their gender identity, and because that identity doesn't fit supposed categories of normal in the society, it can have horrifically damaging consequences on that person, emotionally and mentally, and also physically. So again, a connection between what society is doing and the effects on the individual's body. So the man in the story seems to have so identified himself with the demonic storyline that's told about him that he's taken on this identity, and he answers as if he were the demon. In verse 31, we see an interesting change in pronouns in the story. So let me reread that to you. I'll read verse 30 first. Jesus then asked him, "What is your name?" He said, "Legion," for many demons had entered him. They begged Jesus not to order them to go back into the abyss. So in verse 30, the man speaks. He said, "Legion." He's speaking on behalf of the demon or demons. Verse 31, they begged Jesus. Interesting shift in pronouns here. So Mark's version of this story also contains tension around pronouns. The parallel verse to this one that I just read in Mark's version of the story is, quote, "He," the man, "begged Jesus earnestly not to send them away." Interesting tension around pronouns. Matthew's version of this story eliminates this tension altogether because Matthew says there were two individuals who were possessed. So when Matthew uses the third person plural, there's no tension in the story at all because there are two individuals to begin with. So the fact that they now speak instead of the man speaking for himself could be a sign in the story of a fragmentation between the man and the negative categories that have tormented him for so long. This ambiguity around the pronouns, this tension around the pronouns could be an indication that Jesus is beginning to liberate the man from the negative stories everyone else has been telling about him. And the man himself is now emerging as a human being, a person, a child of God. He's being set free. In verses 32 and 33, Jesus sends the demons into the pigs, which, as I mentioned a little bit ago, has political implications because legion is a name for the Roman army, an explicit connection between Roman imperialism and possession. The legion is sent into pigs, which are non-kosher animals, and then these pigs go and drown themselves in the sea. So there is a political commentary going on in this story, even as it's also a powerful story about the liberation of an individual, which we read explicitly in verse 36. The man is said to be healed in the story. That word, that's the same verb used to describe salvation in the New Testament. It's a word that's so much bigger and richer than simply, quote unquote, going to heaven after you die. This word means things like being rescued, liberated, preserved, set free. So it implies that salvation is about the here and now. It's about setting people free now, not just after death, which incidentally means that this story makes a wonderful connection with Juneteenth, which also is a celebration of people being set free. In verse 37, notice that the people were afraid of Jesus after they witnessed this. He became, in the story, an outcast to save this outcast. Jesus saved the one on the margins, and then Jesus himself became marginalized as a result because the people wanted to kick him and did kick him out of their area. That is a powerful insight, I think, in this story. Jesus became an outcast to save the outcast. He saved the one on the margins, and then he himself became marginalized as a result. So even though this story has elements that might sound frightening or even weird to our modern ears, demonic possession, exorcism, a man among the tombs, etc., I think it has so many beautiful themes in its words. Jesus crosses boundaries. He enters Gentile land. He, so to speak, enters the realm of the dead where this man is living. He's near the outcast in doing so. He sets this man free, and then Jesus himself is forced to leave. And in a way, he sacrifices himself for this one lost sheep, so to speak. The story is a kind of parable that describes the lengths God is willing to go to rescue and set free and save. We might even retell this story as a parable, explicitly as a parable, using the language that Jesus uses when he tells parables. So we might retell the story in this way. The kingdom of God is like a man who was as good as dead, beset by demons within and without, but he was set free by love and compassion. See you next week.